and we can now talk to Justine Greening, former Education Secretary for England. Good morning.
Morning, Martha.
And I know you'll want to make wider points about government education policy, but just picking up immediately on this issue of face masks. I know when I talked to a school that was doing it yesterday, it said in a way it was doing it to encourage confidence amongst parents and children. What do you think of the idea?
I think it is something that ministers and government should consider. It just seems a sensible potential step that should be looked at. Whether it needs to be for the entire school and both primary and secondary is a separate question. But I think, as Alice Wiseman just rightly set out, it is one of the things that can be considered in order to not only put confidence back into a system that badly needs it, but also to be another step that can help, alongside other measures, as she set out, can help reduce risks.
Although looking at what the scientific advisors, chief medical officers and so are saying, it's their belief that there's a very low risk of infection for children.
And I think if you can make that even lower, then that's something that should be considered. I think clearly many parents are understandably concerned to make sure that their children are back in education, but obviously safety is of paramount importance. So I think it's about having a sensible, measured discussion about how face masks might be able to help. And of course, we'll be able to look at what's happening in the Scottish system and learn from that as well.
Now, you've written an article for The Guardian today, very critical of the government's policy, particularly over the exams crisis. And you say that it's actually going to be as damaging for Boris Johnson as the ERM crisis was for John Major's competence on economic management. Can that really be justified, or is it a bit of hyperbole?
I think the question about whether it will prove to be as damaging, and I think it may well be, frankly, the young people around the country and their families who've had their exam results and the year of education 6 months out of school's now disrupted. I think for them this is a massive issue of competence in relation to this government. I think whether or not it has a long-lasting impact for Boris Johnson's administration depends on how he and his wider administration now responds to this exams crisis that we've seen, and whether they can now put in place a plan to get education back up and running, schools open, to help young people who've been affected by the schools shutdown catch up, and whether they can grasp this wider opportunity that this nevertheless presents for us to have a levelling up agenda that really can start to close the gaps that we know mean that talented young people in our country don't get into the roles they could do and don't have the lives ahead of them they should do, purely because of the background and circumstances that they face growing up.
Is it right to blame the government solely for what went wrong? We've talked to ministers on this programme and they say that the algorithm itself was right, it was the application that was wrong, and they'd received a number of assurances from the exam watchdog Ofqual.
I think people are really tired of finger pointing. I think what they want to see are ministers leading an education strategy with support from teaching professionals and wider parts of the education world that can actually enable our education system to get back up and running and children to be able to catch up. I think everybody understands that at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we had to shut down the economy, we had to shut down our schools. But actually, there's been several months since then now, I think, for a plan to be put in place. I think there was significant time to look at some of the challenges that were presented because exams had been cancelled. And I think it is now time to take some decisions around how we can get the education system
So what in particular
open.
then should be done to help disadvantaged children, do you think?
Well, I think we should recognise that exams anyhow are only one part of the picture. It's important that alongside opening schools, we understand that grades themselves are an academic assessment of where a child has got to. That's a relatively narrow picture, frankly, of their talent and future potential. And so from my perspective, whether it's looking at how universities look at a thing called contextualised admissions, which is that they look beyond the grades to the context in which they were achieved, and indeed many of the companies that I'm working with through the Social Mobility Pledge are already looking well beyond academics to this wider potential of the young person and their wider strengths. I think this is a real time now to embed that in our education system and how we look at, if you like, the results that young people are coming out with at the end of their education. And I think beyond that, I'm also saying that it's wrong if ministers feel that too many young people are, for example, going to university and then not able to get high-skilled jobs at the end of the time when they graduate. Actually, the response to that should be to create an economy that is creating those high-skilled jobs and opportunities for them.
Another huge area for discussion, which we have covered on the programme, I'm sure we'll return to. Justine Greening, thank you.